Welcome back to another edition of Decline and Fall. It's another special edition today because we've got with us a guest who's joining us to talk about a book that he's written in about the scandal regarding the Kincora boys' home in Northern Ireland, a long-running scandal that penetrates the very heart of the British establishment. And I'm very pleased to introduce today Chris Moore, who is a veteran journalist of a great deal of experience with the BBC and other outlets, who is joining us today principally to talk about his last book, which is about the Kincora scandal, and potentially the future works he's got lined up as well, which go deeper into other aspects of the scandal as well. So, Chris, thank you for joining us on Decline and Fall today.
You're welcome. I'm very pleased to be able to join you.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Now, if we I'll just start off with our opening gambit here, if you will. Now, you in the book say that you detail how you've been working on the Kincora story for over 40 years now, and it's taken that long for you to unearth more survivors, persuade more people to talk, find more information. But if I can take you back to the very earliest stages of your investigation into this, how long was it that you were on the story until you started to realize that this was something that was much bigger than a case of carers abusing boys, and that there was a much, much bigger story that you were going into here?
Well, I was fortunate that I had good contacts in the police, and within a year of the story breaking, which was on the 24th of January 1980, in the Irish Independent, they didn't mention the Kincora by name. They said there was a boys' home in East Belfast. And we quickly established that this was Kincora. It was a boys' hostel. It was intended to help boys make the step from school to the workplace. So it was actually set up to look after boys in the 12 to 18 age band. So the police came in, and within 3 days, they quickly realized that, yes, there was a justification for the story. Two of the police officers that were working on the case were talking to me, independent of each other. I don't believe to this day that they knew that each other was speaking to me, but they were the people who raised the question over MI5. And when the court case took place a year on, in December 1981, that court case should have been the end of the scandal. But because of this reference to MI5, we were all, journalists were all waiting to see what exactly was going to be said, because the belief was that one of the three staff in Kincora, the lowly house father, was actually working for MI5. Now, that's the story that we were told. On the morning of the court case, when William McGrath, who was allegedly the MI5 spy, when he came before the court, there was a sudden request from his barrister to meet with him in the cells. And when he came up from the cells, he shocked us all in the court, including something like 30 boys who were sitting to give their testimony, waiting in an outer room away from the courtroom itself. And so we were denied what we were expecting: William McGrath to deny all these charges, to put his own spin on the MI5 aspect. And because he changed his mind and decided to go guilty with the five others who were before the court, they were all dealt with and sentenced to prison, convicted, and that was the end of it. There was no uh, there was no ventilation of the facts. And that's why I think it became a scandal, because once you opened Pandora's box, so to speak, there was no getting away from the fact that we were all intrigued by the involvement of MI5 in a boys' hostel.
Indeed. And I was just, I mean, something that really struck me was it's quite clear that, police were getting reports from the late 50s about strange goings on, to say the least, and that there were people coming forward, young boys who'd been abused coming forward, and they met a wall of silence. It was assumed that they were lying, because they were perhaps had some vendetta against the people running the home. I mean, at what stage do you think that MI5 and indeed MI6 learned of Kincora serving as a effective brothel for young boys, or did they always know? Or were they running it from the beginning?
Well, this is the question that we haven't, even after 45 years, we don't know all the answers. And the reason for that is the British government and MI5 have gone to great lengths to cover up the involvement of the state agency MI5, the secret agency, and the British government. And there's something that's causing them extreme embarrassment. And that embarrassment has led to the situation where after 30 years, the state is, and it normally happens in December or January, the state normally releases state secret papers after. In the Kincora case, when the 30 years is up, they've released very few papers. And there was a concern that there were papers that they held that weren't being seen. We now know that the state has decided that files relating to the Kincora Boys Hostel will be held in secret until the year 2065 and 2085. Now, all of us are going to be gone by then. Well, I certainly will. I'm about to be 75, so I'll certainly be. A lot of the people from Kincora will be gone because they'll be so old as to be. They'd have to reach the age of Methuselah to survive for that eventuality in 2085. So there's something unpleasant about this, and the suspicion is that Kincora was a useful tool to the British Secret Service, because not only did it have active homosexuals, the three male members of staff in Kincora were homosexual, but they were also pedophiles, and that perhaps suited the government at the time when they were trying to find out what was going on in the unionist and loyalist communities. And there were homosexual members of both organizations that they would have liked to be able to have a hold on. And perhaps that's what was going on. People do talk about it, about Kincora, as a sort of a honey trap. Government find out more about the secret workings of loyalism and unionism.
Yeah, I was just going to say that on that point, the files related to Kincora not being released, and these completely insane restrictions on and timings for when documents will become available. It's actually one of the, I mean, on paper, it's one of the most investigated scandals in British history. But I mean, all of these official investigations seem to be deliberate fudges where leads are not explored, ignored, where people are not spoken to, where where evidence is discounted. Despite this, some of the reports have thrown up some quite extraordinary findings. So, for instance, the Hart report, which was I think you may well agree, a whitewash. In discussions with MI5, the agency admitted that it did have a compromising film of at least one member of the Kincora gang, so to speak, John McKee, who was a serial killer and paedophile. So and also that same investigation unearthed quite a bit of information on Morris Oldfield, who ended up heading MI6 as well. So I mean, there's quite clearly within what is publicly accessible, there are nuggets of information that can be connected. The mainstream media doesn't seem to be overly interested in pursuing any of these leads. Do you have any potential explanation for why that might be?
I think there's two reasons for this: is the lack of facts that are coming out. Normally, a story stays alive if there's an ongoing revelation in terms of the facts. The British have closed this down. They've taken actions that appear to have impeded the whistleblowers. For example, Colin Wallace, that's one. They've protected the establishment. The establishment includes people like Anthony Blunt, the Russian spy, who had a lover from Northern Ireland called Peter Montgomery. Peter Montgomery was deeply involved in unionism and the Orange Order. He was involved with the BBC in Northern Ireland. He was the chairman of the Arts Council in Northern Ireland, a very well-respected individual who was having the homosexual affair with Anthony Blunt during World War II. It was significant in itself, because when Montgomery, as a captain in the British Army Intelligence, came back from the front line to get a little bit of rest and respite at home in 5 Mile Town, one of his house guests was a Russian spy. So there's something deeper that is being held back. In this book, what I've tried to do is to take all the disparate elements of the story and put them into one place, and that material is stuff that I've accumulated over the years. The recent inspiration to write the book came with the provision of secret documents that were given to me by sources, and some of which, to be fair, turned up in the HIA inquiry. But the HIA inquiry was, I'm afraid, like the first inquiry. In 1982, the government decided it was going to have a judicial inquiry, where the inquiry would have the powers of the High Court to compel witnesses and documents. And the person who resisted that most of all was the legal advisor for MI5. I've got copies of his telex messages, his written messages, which show that he took on the government and defied the government and defied the Northern Ireland Director of Public Prosecution, Sir Barry Shaw. They just assumed they didn't have to provide any witnesses or any documents if they didn't want to. And in order to avoid that, the best way to do it was to help the government decide to have a whitewash inquiry under Judge William Hughes, a retired English judge. MI5 had specified we should have an English judge. MI5 specified, and they got that the restrictions on the inquiry under Hughes would be to look at social services. There was no investigation whatsoever of the police or MI5 links to the hostel, and that has maintained. There have been 7 inquiries into Kincora. 3 of them were the police inquiries. 4 were so-called public inquiries. They all were restricted, including Hart's HIA inquiry, the most recent one. You know, it's absolutely horrendous when you think that 3 or 4 of MI5's top executives were meeting in London to consider how they would handle the secret investigation the police in Northern Ireland were about to do in relation to two people who had close links to MI5 and MI6. That's Fred Holroyd and Colin Wallace. And it was a secret investigation undertaken by George Caskey, whom I got to know very well through my work. And Caskey at one stage put me on the floor of his car, put a rug over me, and smothered me into Castlereagh Barracks to let me have a look at some Kincora files. I wasn't allowed to.
Wow.
Because he sipped whiskey and he turned the pages. Now, in those days, there were no mobile phones. I didn't have a camera. I had a notebook and I was scribbling. But in the couple of hours that we spent there, I couldn't possibly absorb everything that was in the files. But it was of great assistance to me. And George was really annoyed that MI5, to use his words, obstructed his investigation. They obstructed it by refusing to produce an important MI5 boss. The man who was in charge of MI5 in Northern Ireland had refused a captain in Army Intelligence named Brian Gemmell permission to alert the police to the dangers of children from William McGrath, the MI5 agent who was in Kincora. And that happened at the same time as a police investigation wanted to further investigate Kincora. They were investigating an individual case of child sex abuse by an uncle of a boy who was in public care. When he was led to Kincora, he took pictures of cars. He did his own surveillance. He did some pictures of people going in and out, men who were going in and out of Kincora at times when you would least expect them to be there, businessmen, two part-time judges, justices of the peace, and funny enough, 2 senior Northern Ireland office officials who happened both to be MI5. One of whom had been fined £100 for soliciting male sex at a public toilet in London, in a railway station at London. I found that cutting in the BBC library in 1982. So he was blocked. The Army Intelligence officer was blocked, and I suppose MI5 thought, oh, that's the end of it. But what they hadn't bargained for was the social workers who told me about the story of the investigation of the boy who claimed his uncle was sexually assaulting him. Not only that he was taking him, the boy, to meet other men for the purposes of sexual encounter. So when I tracked down the boy's father to Watford, just north of London, he told me that he had visited Northern Ireland to speak to the police. At the time, the boy's allegations were made, and he said the police showed him photographs, most of which he said were innocuous photographs of the boy with men. But there was one photograph in which his son was engaged in a sex act with a man, and in the background he saw a similar sex act being performed by another young boy. So he was aware of this. He put me in touch with the son. I interviewed the son in Silhouette, and that was the beginning of a whole new rake. This was in February 1982, and that was the beginning of the Kincora scandal that pertains to this day because of the lack of truth. Little dribs and drabs come out, and we know for a fact from some very courageous boys who I've known for, well, since 1980, some of them. One boy I missed in 1982 called Richard Kerr, a very courageous boy who now lives in Texas. And Richard came to me in 2014. That's how long. And when I went to Texas and interviewed him, he was the first person who was part of the paedophile ring in Kincora. And he told us at that time about how boys were taken out on the at the behest of the warden of Kincora Boys Hostel. That was Joe Mains. And Joe Mains took them to England, to various parts of Ireland, south of the border, north of the border. He had taken photographs of the boys and would show these to other paedophiles so that they could, it was kind of a mail order thing. Oh, here's the boys that I have available. Which one do you want? And that's how Richard described it. But Richard is doing that now in the knowledge that he's older, he's a bit wiser, and he's wanting to get it off his chest. But he has, for years, kept quiet about it. I did ask him when I first met him in 2014. I said, did you ever recognize any of the men that you were with? And he said, Chris, after we'd been plied with drink in the bar and were taken upstairs to meet these men, my eyes never got above their waistline. Frightening, disgusting. But that's the way in which he described it. And he then described how he basically became a male prostitute in London near the King's Cross station. And then he was advised either by MI5 officers or two plainclothes police officers, he's not certain, told him to go to a nightclub that had opened for gay people. And that night, he was to go there at 9 o'clock and ask for a Mr. Ferguson, an American gentleman. And he did that. And he and Ferguson became lovers. Ferguson identified the plight of Richard and took Richard to the expensive shops for clothes, kitted him out, found him a nice apartment not far from Madame Tussauds in London. And that's how he got out of the UK, because the MI5 and the plainclothes police officers he called at this apartment said in front of Mr. Ferguson, he's got to stop talking about Kincora. He's got to shut up. That's how they left and went to the United States. And he showed me his bank statements. At one stage, he was $1 millionaire. Mr. Ferguson was very kind to him, looked after him extremely well. Left him when Mr. Ferguson died. He left property and funds for Richard. And so when you have that kind of financial clout allied to the government, because Mr. Ferguson was basically in Britain working for the government on the oil rigs. So that kind of clout by the establishment or on behalf of the establishment in London is very powerful. And Richard and the others steered the consequences of speaking up to her.
Chris, you mentioned previously the man who was at the center or the most violent and horrific abuse at Kincora was a man called William McGrath. Now, McGrath, when you mentioned in the book, was a very significant figure in Unionist and Loyalist politics in Northern Ireland. Can you explain for the purposes of explaining this to the audience, just how significant a figure he was? And why it was, do you think, that MI5 in particular had an interest in not only recruiting him, but also, it appears, protecting him for quite a significant period of time?
Well, if you cast your minds back to the beginnings of the conflict in Northern Ireland, the insurrection was seen to be coming from the Catholic side, from the Republican side, IRA. On the other side, the police had and the government had very little information about Unionists and Loyalists and how they might work together to defeat the insurrection by the Republicans. So the British were playing very rapid game of catch up in terms of getting intelligence on Loyalists and Unionists. And of course, William McGrath fitted into that scenario perfectly, and here's why. In 1958, I was told by the police who were investigating Kincora that McGrath was heading off to Dublin, and MI6 took an interest in where he was going in Dublin because they thought he was off to meet a KGB agent. According to Hart, he actually met 3 communists from South American countries. But in either case, there was some interest from MI6. Then when the conflict began to take hold, there was a changeover in the early 70s, and MI6 dropped out because it was supposedly looking after Britain's interests abroad. MI5 was the organization that was to look after the integrity of the British state from within. And so MI5 became the principal gatherer of intelligence in Northern Ireland. McGrath, they planted him in Kincora, but they had an interest in him because McGrath, here's the connections McGrath had, and he lived his life in all these different compartments. You know, his wife and his kids didn't know about some of the aspects of his life. So he was in the Orange Order. He was very closely linked with the paramilitaries in the UVF. He had his own ginger group, which became a kind of a paramilitary group called Tara. He set up his own Orange Lodge, which had a Gaelic inscription on the banner. McGrath had this all-Ireland view that he wanted, but he wanted it to be under a Union flag and not under the tricolor that is the flag of the Irish Republic. McGrath also had amazing, for a man who was a working class guy from part of North Belfast, he had this most magnificent connection to very senior Unionists. Sir Knox Cunningham, who was the leader of the Unionist Party at the time. He was the MP for Southampton. He was the personal private secretary to the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. He was involved in all of the establishment groups that he could be involved in London. And when he eventually retired and his agent, Jim Molyneux, took over as the South Antrim MP, Knox Cunningham, who went to Cambridge, knew Anthony Blunt, was familiar with a number of homosexual paedophiles, and he befriended them, and he was part of this, cartel, basically, it was. And the man who told me about it in 1990 and 91 was a Northern Ireland author called James. He wrote under a false name, but his real name was Robin Bryans, and he had a very close relative in Belfast who was head of the Orange Order and who was a mentor to William McGrath. So you had all of these connections. McGrath was well connected. McGrath told his followers that he worked for MI5. McGrath told his followers that he occasionally would have to attend meetings of the London-Belfast Committee in London, and he would go there for those meetings. So he was well connected. His job was to give the government an insight into what was happening in unionism, and one of the best things that he actually did was he told the British government about a plan to have UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And the person who was talking in political terms about that was McGrath's mentor, unionist mentor, Ian Paisley. And McGrath tried to disguise his links with Paisley. He was actually a member of Paisley's church, and Paisley married two of McGrath's children in his church. And yet, when I confronted McGrath after he'd served his prison sentence, he said, "Oh, they weren't children of mine." Until I pointed out that I had the wedding certificates, I knew, and he eventually conceded that. But if I hadn't got some knowledge of him, he would have told me lies all day long. And that's the way he survived. He was able to keep his homosexual world away from all the other aspects. And the homosexual world is important because it was an illegal pastime at the time. It was a convenient way in which the British authorities, MI5, if they found out that you were having a homosexual relationship, then it was going to be a lot easier for them to put the pressure on you to do their bidding. And I'm afraid that's what happened. When the police examined McGrath, two things happened. Number one, the police surgeon who examined McGrath declared that McGrath's anal passage indicated that he'd been a homosexual for a long time. And during the examination, McGrath had an erection. And those were both noted. I mentioned those to McGrath when I confronted him face to face, and he has a strange way of dealing with when he's confronted with facts like that. Because he said to me, "Well, I'm aware of what the police surgeon said, but you have to respect that. But it's not true." How do you square that up? McGrath was the master of. He was charismatic, and he was able to, to convince people that they should stick with him because he had this uncanny ability to predict what was going to happen in Northern Ireland. And that's the job of MI5. MI5 look ahead 5 years, 10 years, 15 or 20 years down the line. And that would make sense if he was telling the truth. about the information he's got from MI5.
Well, just to follow up on that, I mean, McGrath denied everything in his initial interrogations by the police. And as you said earlier, Chris, he suddenly changed his plea to guilty at the absolute last minute. You speculate in the book that this may be down to a conversation that was had with him by perhaps his handlers to say, look, plead guilty because we can't have this out in open court. Because you said that in your previous answer that there was like 30 odd boys ready to testify, some of whom presumably knew things about the rest of the paedophile ring, which McGrath was a part of, and might have had knowledge of people like Blunt, people like Mountbatten and others. So it would seem that his handlers were desperate for the trial to end as quickly as possible and for McGrath to be put away for a while. Do you think that he was basically told, you've got to plead guilty or else, essentially?
That has to be educated speculation, I would say. There's no way I know what was said. However, the person who was his barrister was a man called Desmond Bow. And Desmond Bow was a very close friend of Ian Paisley's. And Desmond Bow was a co-founder of the Democratic Unionist Party, which Paisley was headed up. So there's that circle of friends. They're all in this together to a certain extent, but I don't think they were fully aware of the other lives that McGrath had. And certainly his children, I knew his son-in-law, Frank Miller, quite well, because Frank was the Unionist Party, the secretary of the Unionist Party, and he went on to become a journalist and became the London correspondent for the Irish Times eventually when he got away from Northern Ireland. And who can blame him to get out from under that dreadful shadow that was cast by his father-in-law. So yeah, it was all about Britain gathering information. As you mentioned, recently I was working on a BBC commissioned film about lost boys in Belfast. We had 5 lost boys. 4 disappeared without ever being seen again. That was in 1969 and 1973. In 73, a 5th boy who'd gone missing for just over a week was found dismembered and in the River Lagan in Hessian bags. And what was missing from him was his head. So we had a situation where boys were going missing. We did the programme. The BBC accepted the programme and signed off on it. And then, for some reason, they changed their minds and said that the journalism wasn't up to standard. I think the thing that perhaps put them off, at least I'm told this by the filmmakers, alley cats, the thing that might have put the BBC off was I was to do research work and some production work, but I ended up being interviewed because of my connections to Kincora. And in that respect, I said during the interview, I produced a document which showed how the loyalists regarded a gentleman who was head of a religious school in North Belfast. And they said that he was an agent of the British state. That man's father got in touch with me and showed me a letter that his son had written. He'd found in his son's briefcase, and it was a letter, I still have it. It was a letter which showed that he was prepared to sign a pact with the devil if he could have his homosexual lover as someone to spend the rest of his years with. bear in mind, he was married with a couple of kids at this thing. He was a school teacher. I have friends who I played golf with who taught in that school. I tried to get him, but failed because he went away one Easter when I was looking for him. And he often went over to America, where he went to, I think, give talks in Bob Jones University, where Paisley had got his doctorate in religious affairs. So there's a great deal that's not been exposed yet. I don't know what those facts are, but the program Lost Boys, which was never shown on BBC, but we took it away and showed it in Dublin and in Belfast, and then it went on cinemas. We met through that a man who lives now in Australia. We went to Australia, and his name is Arthur Smith, and Arthur told us about how McGrath introduced him to Mountbatten in Kincora in the summer of 1977. We were able to work that out. I was able to find out by looking at the diaries for Mountbatten that he was in Ireland in his castle in County Sligo for all of July and then the early part of August 1977. There were 5 boys who have, between myself and Andrew Lowney, who had written the history of the Mountbattens with help from FBI files. So we were confident that there were 5 boys who had complaints about Mountbatten. I personally have spoken to 3 boys who told me about their experience with Mountbatten. The latest one was not in the book because I met him after the book was published, and I met him in the Irish Republic. Sorry, the book hadn't been published, but it had been, the final manuscript was with the publisher. And so when you've got 3 boys, now men of course, saying that they were sexually assaulted by this member of the royal family, 3 out of the 5, and the other 2 were interviewed by Andrew Lowney. And I know one of the ones that was interviewed by Andrew Lowney was a friend of Richard Kerr, and they worked together in London as a double act. So when you have that situation, I think it's justifiable to include that in the book, to ask the question of the authorities. The FBI files were ordered to be closed after Andrew Lowney had accessed them. The British told the Americans to close those up. And so when Andrew went back for more information, he was told, "Oh, they've all gone. They've been destroyed." So there's another element there that possibly Mountbatten is the reason, because the secret services were set up in 1909 in Britain, and one of their principal reasons to exist was to protect the monarch and the monarch's family. And that suggests that continues to this day. The other thing that occurred in Belfast when we had the film premiered in Dublin, and the next night it was in Belfast in the cinema. And when it finished, the woman sitting in the row in front of me stopped me and asked me if I would talk to her. And she said, "I've got a friend. He's living in Australia now, but I sent him the trail for this film that I had been given. The trail was 2 minutes 55 seconds long, and at 2 minutes. I can't remember the exact number of seconds, but this guy who was watching it on his laptop at home in Perth, in Australia, nearly collapsed because there was the face of a man that he says tried to abduct him from the street outside his home in 1973 in Republican West Belfast. The man he identified was William McGrath. McGrath, I mean, the police at the time had no idea about McGrath being that sort of violent person. They learned that from the testimony and the statements made particularly by two boys who were in Kincora. But this was an illustration, and justifiably included in the program, I think, because if McGrath was running around in a car with another man trying to snatch kids, who's to say he didn't snatch any of the 4 missing boys? Who's to say he didn't snatch the boy who was dismembered, who cut up and put into a Hessian bag?
Who's to say that he wasn't prowling the streets with Mountbatten in his car? I think that your book kind of kicks off with a distressing tale of a young boy called Arthur who was sent to Kincora by a Belfast divorce court judge who thought that he'd be safe there, and instead he was a continual subject of rape by William McGrath, but also an individual that Arthur was only knew as at the time as Dickie, and he this Dickie was given repeated access to Arthur at Kincora. This is one of a great many distressing stories in your book. I warn our viewers and listeners that it's certainly not an easy read, although it's an absolutely vital one, and I would urge you to get your hands on a copy as soon as possible. But what's really striking is that Arthur, of course, didn't know who this individual was until August 1979, when he happened to be watching the news on TV, and there was a report of Mountbatten's assassination by the IRA, who reportedly booby-trapped his private boat, and Arthur saw Dickie's face on TV and realised that he was Mountbatten, and therefore a member of the British royal family. Now, Mountbatten's a very interesting character, and as you know, Andrew Lowney unearthed FBI records that it's openly stated that he was a paedophile. We interviewed Andrew recently, and again, if our viewers hadn't caught that, please do. It's absolutely fascinating. But yeah, I mean, given that Mountbatten was something of a troublemaker, and he was involved in various plots to try and overthrow Harold Wilson and install himself as Britain's ruler, and this only ceased due to a direct intervention from Queen Elizabeth. Do you think that there's any prospect that perhaps because he was such a liability, from the perspective of both being a troublemaker, but also in it politically, but also being a rather unabashed paedophile, who was quite clearly not doing very much beyond adopting a false name to conceal his identity from his victims? Do you think that there is any prospect that his assassination was perhaps allowed to happen by MI5 or MI6? To get rid of a troublesome element within the ranks?
That argument holds great sway among people. I don't think they have any real evidence of it, but it is that has been garnered by people who observe these things. And that's when in 2021, there was an appeal court hearing in London, and 4 NGOs, 4 groups that operate outside the government, 2 from Northern Ireland, which were the Amnesty International. Patrick Corrigan was their spokesman. Daniel Holder was the spokesperson for the Committee for the Administration of Justice. Now, they were challenging MI5 and the courts and the government to say, what's written down here? What are the rules governing criminality involving MI5 personnel, agents, or informers? And they got one of the barristers for the government and for MI5, and they got him in the witness box, and they said to him, what are the rules here? And he began by saying, well, there aren't any. I was witness, like Daniel Alder. I wasn't present, but I'm taking it from Daniel, and I've also confirmed it with Patrick Corrigan. So that tells you that if it suited Britain to remove somebody troublesome, then it can happen. I made mention of this in a live BBC programme where myself and 2 of the owner of Alley Cats and his director and producer, Des Henderson and Ed Storton. What happened was, I said that I told the story that I just told you about the court case in 2021 was 9th of March, that the ruling came from the judges. And when I mentioned that, the programme went off air. Just like there was dead air for 15 minutes or perhaps slightly longer. Of course, if you had streamed the programme, they couldn't stop that. So that continued on. But there's no record, apparently, in the BBC Sounds archive of the programme ever taking place. So we know that Britain is capable of killing if it suits. What we don't know is when they choose to do it.
Indeed. And I mean, there's another kind of related kind of fascinating excerpt of your book where you discuss how there were 2 Irish journalists who produced a documentary called No Stone Unturned. This is Trevor Burney and Barry McCaffrey, and they revealed the identities of a unionist paramilitary gang that was responsible for the murder of 6 Catholics in June 1994. While in a bitter irony, they watched Ireland beat Italy in a World Cup football match. Now, this section it details how the 2 journalists have unearthed extensive evidence of how the Northern Irish police ran what they described as a quote unquote defensive operation to spy on the phones of hundreds of journalists and hundreds of lawyers. Among those journalists, yourself, Chris.
Well, I'm on the periphery at the moment. I'm trying to find out. The problem is you have to depend on the very people who are capable of lying their way through the Last Supper or whatever it suits them. That's the only way you're ever going to find out the truth. My telephone number was on the information that was shared with Barry and Trevor, and that at that time I was able to help in a small way with some of the detail of what exactly the police knew and who knew it. So that's why my phone numbers was listed. I have now taken an interest, and at present I'm trying to work out how best I can progress my case against the British Secret Service. At this moment, it's not clear if I've got a case that will sustain or whether it'll fall at the next hurdle, because, as I say, you're dependent on those people who are very capable. As I began to tell earlier, the senior MI5 officers who were confronted with having to deal with George Castane's investigation, they had this meeting and they gave the minutes to Judge Hart. And in that meeting, one of these very senior MI5 officers said, well, why don't we just give George false files? Okay. And what would your first question be? Right? My first question would be, have you done this before? How often? What was the last time you did it? Hart didn't ask any of those questions. He palavered and rode around it in such a way that eventually he said, oh, it couldn't possibly be true. And so they escaped. But if they're prepared to do that and have the ability to do that, they also, MI5, I could show because of the documents that I got. MI5 interfered with Colin Wallace's appeal against dismissal. They actually were able to take the chairman of the appeal committee and take him into their office and show him files and say, here's the files. And the thing about it is that what was he shown? He was only shown what they wanted him to say. You know, and yet the ruling was, oh, sorry, Mr. Wallace, you weren't unfairly dismissed at all. That was the aim of this. And fortunately, it didn't work, and Colin was able to prove that for 15 years, the Ministry of Defence and Mighty Thatcher lied to Parliament and lied to the British people about his secret role. It was only when another person in the MOD decided to investigate further that they found that Colin Wallace had been telling the truth, that he did have a contract of employment that allowed him to work with the secret services like MI5 and to engage in spreading and disseminating false news and black propaganda. And, you know, it's just, you know, Britain's supposed to be the place where the mother of all parliaments, is the phrase that's been used. But, you know, the mother of democracy? No. They behave like a third world banana republic behind the scenes while they have this public. So we are the good guys.
Chris, you mentioned earlier that you're working on, you mentioned in the book, you're working on a follow-up to this book about the Lost Boys scandal and its connections to Kincora. I think it would be fitting if we concluded our discussion today if you by you just talking about what that book's going to be like, and like what you're hoping to get across in that next work.
Well, I'm not sure there will be a next book. That's an aspiration at this stage, because there's so little information and so many people, believe it or not, from the days of Kincora and certainly from the days when the boys went missing in 69 and 73. There are so many people who've died and passed on. And I don't think there's anything meaningful that I can do at this stage. But that doesn't stop me from trying. And my intention would be to try and take it further. and whether that or not that works. I tell you what is intriguing for me, and that slightly connects to this is the involvement of the secret services and what they've done in this country, in Northern Ireland, and I'm still interested in that. But I'm working on the on the grounds that I'm too old for them to be interested in anything. That remains to be seen.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for this very illuminating and quite frankly explosive interview. We greatly appreciate your time. How can people support your work? Is there do you use social media? Can people donate to you? That sort of thing.
No, I've got a very little understanding of social media.
Lucky you.
I still buy newspapers, so that tells you all you need to know. No, I'm not looking for any financial reward. If anyone has information about, and this is what motivates me more than anything, is the mistreatment of children. I've looked at so many stories in the past, and it's absolutely disgusting how men particularly, but sometimes women as well, are involved in robbing a child of something that can never, ever be replaced and may potentially damage that individual for a lifetime. It's life-changing circumstances, and I'm disgusted. I have no time for people who would do that. So it got so this got personal for me 24 years ago yesterday, when my first grandchild was born 24 years ago. And I have to explain to my wife when she asked me, how come when we look after the grandchild, you don't change her nappies? And I said, I'm sorry, I can't touch her. I've heard so many stories. I don't want to touch her. So I have to get help. And I got some counselling, and for a time, short time, a matter of months, I stopped talking to people. Because I had made a program about Kincora, and I'd made a program about Brendan Smith, the Catholic police, I felt that I owed a debt to the people who found the courage to speak up. And so I never turned anyone away. I made it clear I wasn't trained properly. I was a good listener. And when I listened, I could maybe help them find a way of getting the kind of advice and help that they needed to help them overcome this. But I had to go back to doing that because I couldn't forever leave the plight of children to our society, because they haven't a clue, haven't a bloody clue how to treat our children. Our society mistreats children a second time when they find the voice and they come forward and there's a conviction in court, and the offender, the rapist, gets 18 months suspended for 2 years. That's disgusting. Society needs to realize, if you want to protect the next generation of children, you need to be of sterner heart, and you need to lock these boys up for life, because they will never, ever change. That's my motivation.
Well, Chris, I think everybody watching would wholeheartedly endorse those sentiments, and I would encourage everybody to read the book. It's called Kincora, Britain's Shame. and it's available at all major, well, on the major online bookstores. So, Chris Moore, this has been a very illuminating discussion. So, thank you for coming on the Decline and Fall show today.
Yeah, and thank you for your public service, Chris. It's sorry, excuse me. Yeah, no, thank you for your public service, Chris. I think you are doing tremendous work. And not only a service to history, but the service to so many victims in the process too. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kit, for your time, and thank you, Alex, for your time as well.
God bless you, Chris. Take care.
Thanks very much.
Keep up the fight.